We're continuing to talk about how Jesus shaped his disciples. And I've been presenting this metaphor of 4 chairs, not as doctrine, but just as a picture of maybe to see in our minds the processes and the stages or phases that Jesus took people through to prepare them to do his work. The first stage, the first chair, was come and see. Jesus simply invited people to come and see who he was and learn truth about him. And oftentimes those who would come and see then would follow. He invited people to follow him. He said, "Follow me." And that's a little bit more of a commitment. That's a little bit more of a focus. The third chair is it's the space for people who've gone fishing, for those who have taken up the challenge that Jesus suggested, that we be fishers of men. And the fourth chair, what we'll talk about tonight to bring this all together, is go and bear fruit. And that is, as John tells us here, recording the words of Jesus, that is God's will for our lives, to go and bear fruit. With some of the material I was using to prepare this lesson, the teacher suggested that a lot of people are comfortable in the first and second chairs. That we realize that there's a need. We realize that Jesus is truth. But a whole lot of change doesn't take place in that person's life. Their following is, maybe we could just use an idea, following at a distance, and not duplicating in your life the things that Jesus was doing or the things that Jesus taught his disciples. To move into the fourth chair requires focus, but it results in a special relationship with God. And that's what we'll look at tonight in John 15. So I hope you're there in John 15. And one of the things that we begin to discover as we occupy this fourth chair is that it's not about me. It's not about you. And you cannot do this on your own. I learned a little bit about bearing fruit through my experiment as a community gardener last year. I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take one of those plots and plant some of my favorite vegetables and just enjoy that. I planted zucchini. Lenita can make a pretty mean zucchini bread. I planted corn on the cob because my favorite meal is ribeye and corn on the cob. Can I get an amen? And tomatoes. Who doesn't like tomatoes? And who doesn't need lycopene in their diet? Did you just raise your hand? You don't like tomatoes? All right, that's okay. Some people don't like tomatoes. So I had to work the ground because it was quite a mess. My first harvest was rocks. Had to clear all the rocks out and work in the fertilizer. Planted the plants, watered the plants, and when it came time for harvest, the zucchini went well, but the word on the street is you really have to be dumb to mess up zucchini. That's what I was told, okay? The tomatoes, they were all cherry tomatoes, and it was just way too much, and the corn was a disappointment. It kind of tasted like cardboard. So, needless to say, I did not take out a plot this year because it was a bad experience. But it wasn't because the plan wasn't a good plan. It was because of my execution of the plan. Now, I worked the ground. I planted the plants or the seeds. I watered and I harvested. But in all of those, my timing was off. And sometimes if you forget to water your garden, that's going to have a negative effect on it, yes. My knowledge was limited. I knew something. I went to a couple of Ben's seminars, but my knowledge was limited on what was happening. The effort was just enough. And if you looked at my garden plot, you may have seen these great big, tall corn plants. But the fruit was not good. And I think it's because of my inability or my refusal to do the work that it took to result in good fruit. And there's a parallel to our Christian life. And the parallel is this, that those same things that it takes to cultivate a good garden, and that's the purpose for the metaphor that Jesus uses. That the same effort is needed in my faith, and I sure hope that the fruit of my Christian life is much more than what took place in my community garden plot. One, in the big scheme of things, doesn't matter, but the other one is eternal. It has eternal significance. A couple of questions is, here's a picture of a community garden. So that's not ours. I couldn't, I wanted to take a picture of ours. Our community garden was amazing. Did you see that thing? What an amazing space that hill of weeds has been transformed into. This is one in Portland, but you can see them busy doing their stuff and everything looks good. And so good for them. Do I have to bear fruit? I think a lot of people ask that question. Do I really have to bear fruit? And I think it's a complicated question because maybe some people think of it as some sort of a comparison game. Do I have to bear as much fruit as that person does? Or am I saved if I don't bear fruit? And who's going to determine whether or not I'm bearing fruit? I'm bearing much fruit. And the quality of my fruit. Who's the judge of that? So we don't like that question because of the answers that might come with it. But the focus should not be on comparison. It should not be on someone judging the quality, some other human, some other person, a brother or sister judging the quality of your fruit. It's really between you and God. But it does have to be, and we can decide as we work through this whether or not we agree with it, but it does have to be a focus in my life. Verse 8 of our text, and then we'll read the whole thing in a minute. Verse 8 says, "My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples." I think that's a pretty clear statement about what God intends. Now, we may have a different idea, and we may have a different standard, or we may define it differently. Someone said this is the problem with the church community. The church has generally had a difficulty in dealing with lack of productivity in disciples. The main reason is that it lacks the wisdom and God's sense of purpose. And I agree with both of those statements. If I'm committed to God's purpose, then I'm going to embrace verse 8 fully. It's not a performance thing, but I think this is what glorifies God. Some translations say it is God's will that you bear much fruit, right? Some of the translations say that. While it is God who does the pruning and removal. The church does not usually wish removal to take place because of its attachment to the numerical size and a worldly sense of what is important. And this statement, this paragraph is important because it's really God who does the pruning and the removal. So it's the conviction of this is not going to happen because of what I say or what someone else says. Hopefully, the conviction comes from your connection with God. And when you read John 15, verse 8, you go, I'm not sure that I'm glorifying God with my life. That has to come from you. That has to be your conviction. That has to be the conviction that the Holy Spirit is working in your life so that you will take the steps that you need to take. Not for me to force you to take the steps. In other words, the boundaries of the church have often become fuzzy today, and I think that's true. A lot of times we can't tell the difference between the faith community and any other community. It's fuzzy today and almost non-existent. That is not the case in some parts of the world where it can be very costly to be a Christian, when one's life may be at stake. In those places, the boundary lines are much clearer. I think if something glorifies God, we should embrace it. The other question is, what is the fruit? What is the fruit that Jesus is talking about in this passage? So let's go ahead and read it real quick. John 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes. And he prunes every branch that produces fruit, so that it will produce more fruit. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I in you. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him produces much fruit, because you can do nothing without me. If anyone does not remain in me, he is thrown aside like a branch, and he withers. They gather them, throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you want, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved you, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have spoken these things to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, that someone would lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you slaves anymore, because a slave doesn't know what his master is doing. I have called you friends because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you that you should go out and produce much fruit, and that your fruit should remain, so that whatever you ask in the name of the Father, in my name, he will give you. This is what I command you. Love one another. So what is the fruit? I wanted to read the passage in there because he really doesn't say specifically what it is. And there's a lot of debate and scholarly discussion about what it means. What is the fruit? And there are two big ideas that come up. The first one is, as it relates to what we read in Galatians 5 about the fruit of the Spirit. I just have one comment on that. And that is, what Paul's talking about in Galatians 5 is the fruit of the Spirit. not the fruit of me. Right? It's the fruit of the Spirit as you allow the Spirit to work in your life. And that's going to be demonstrated that you're going to possess these characteristics. But for what? Just to possess these characteristics? To do good works. Okay. I think that's exactly... Did you say that? Or did Jack? Okay. All right. It's like throwing your voice. Go ahead, Ken, real quick.
That's why, if Christ is the church, and he says you got to remain in me, in the vine, that's being here, right? Like
connected, yeah. Yeah, good point, yeah.
While you're here, the fruit you bear while you're here,
Yeah, yeah.
So that's love for my brothers and sisters and service to them.
Yeah.
It's presented.
Yeah. So he said, love and service to them however it's presented. So however, maybe out of your gift, what you can serve. Yeah, yeah. And I want to say specifically, it's the result of your Christian life. It's the result of the character that you demonstrate. Which means sometimes my fruit can be not so good because sometimes I allow the characteristics of the world to invade my space. But Jesus is talking about, Paul is talking about the fact that if this is what someone who's walking according to the Spirit, this is what it looks like. So again, that's another idea. We have to buy into that. We have to adopt that ethic for ourselves. That I want my life to look like the Spirit is bearing fruit in my life, which is the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. The fruit that Jesus is talking about, then, are the good works, the good things that come out of who you are. So it's the way you engage wherever your life is, if it's in your family, if it's in your school, if it's in your place of business, if it's somewhere in the community, that there is going to be a positive effect on life around you. So with that in mind, and we can talk a little bit more about that, let's look at a little bit more detail, John 15. And the first point I want to make is that we understand that this is God's will for your life. To buy into that value and that ethic, that my life must reproduce something. And that comes from careful and intentional cultivation. And the first point I want to highlight from John chapter 15 is that Jesus expects that we would bear fruit. That's his expectation in our lives, that we would bear fruit. That's where all of it's going. That's where the time that he spent with the disciples, he wanted them to be able to do the things he was doing so that they could teach others and baptize others and pass on this ethic to them. Why? So that they could teach others and baptize others. Or maybe even if you don't get to the point of baptism, your teaching results in something that's positive. I think that's fruit as well. That there is a life positively affected because of your interaction with that life. We buy into this, that this is what Jesus expects of us. Second, when you bear fruit, he prunes you. So that means he's taken away the waste product on your branch so that you will bear more fruit. And what I got out of this is that I just need to get in there and start trying to do something positive. Oftentimes we hold back because we feel like we have to be perfect. We feel like Well, that's for the trained people. That's not my responsibility. And not because I don't want to, because I don't think I would be very valuable at it. Several years ago, William Carter, since he's not here, I'm gonna call him out. And William was one of our young leaders. He had gotten his life into kind of a mess, and so he had made some commitments. And I'm so happy for William and the things that he's turned around in his life. But he was starting to lead some stuff in the youth group, and several times, like he would lead a song, and he'd lead it too high, and it'd kind of mess up. Or he'd lead it too low, or maybe it's a song that no one really knew, and so it wouldn't be a real warm, fuzzy, positive experience. And he just like anyone who tries to step out like that, he'd feel like a fool. He said, "Man, I feel stupid." And I said, "If I had a nickel for every time I felt stupid in my leadership in the church, I'd be a millionaire." And he goes, "What?" He just didn't get it. I think he probably does now, because he's been through life and he's failed and has made some changes in his life and knows how to succeed. But unless we make mistakes, we never learn how to do things successfully, effectively. We have to know what not to do before we know what to do. And that's true in every aspect of life. And it's true in this aspect of life, in this expectation that Jesus has for us to bear fruit. Sometimes people will look at this and they'll say, "So I have to bear fruit to be saved." If you're asking that question, you're asking the wrong question. And that's what I think Jesus is saying here. That you're already clean. You're already saved. You are already in me. See, that's not the issue. The issue is remaining in me. And I think Jesus fully expects us to buy into this fully. Why wouldn't you want to remain in him? Give me one good reason. I'll wait. There's not. Why would you not want to remain in him? So that's not the issue. And if that's the issue, that means I'm maybe asking the question, what is the least I can get away with and still be on the good side? And that's the wrong question to ask. That's the wrong place to be. Remain. I wonder if what Jesus means is not only just staying committed, but through the pruning process. Because I believe, and I've experienced, that pruning hurts. Does it hurt trees when you prune them? Okay, so I said yes. I don't know. Trees always look better after Miss Wendy prunes them, but for humans to go through the process of the removal of things that hinder our growth can be very painful. And that would be if you want to bail, that's a good time to bail. And that's where a lot of folks choose that as a good time to bail. Because the pain of becoming a fruitful follower of Jesus is too great and too difficult. And it's costing me too much. I have to give up too much. That is why I think he says ask. Is that if I'm struggling, I need to ask. I need to ask him. I need to pray about these concerns. That's how I develop in my mindset the sense of God's purpose, by asking. James says the same thing. Any of you lack wisdom, ask. That's the same point. That as I go through this process, and maybe I don't understand why I'm going through this thing, but as I'm going through this, and I have questions, I need to ask. And then I believe, as it says in verse 8 there, that this is evidence of an authentic follower of Christ. It says, "My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples." Again, I think it's important when we read these verses that we internalize them ourselves. It is not my qualification for you. It is not my standard that I'm going to put up against you, and if you don't follow this, then you're in trouble. It is the standard that I have to have for myself. My relationship is not between me and God through you. It's between me and God. Now, you might be a counselor in my life. You might be a mentor in my life. You might be someone I can ask questions to in my life. But I want to be an authentic child of God. And if this is what Jesus says, then I'm going to figure out what that means and what that looks like in my life. Jesus never just tells us what to do without helping us understand the value of it to our lives. And so the benefits of remaining is what the next section brings out. One is that we will experience a love relationship. And I think that is so significant. When you hit on this sort of a relationship, whether it's with your spouse or with one of your children or with a friend or something, when you hit on a relationship that's truly love. Now, again, that's not the warm, fuzzy unicorns and rainbows sort of love. This is two people in a relationship committed to huggy sort of love, huggy sort of love, huggy sort of love. And that is two people in a relationship that are in that relationship for the benefit of others. That's what love is. Love isn't the feeling. The feeling, I think, follows the action. But the action is that I'm in this relationship for the benefit of the other person. I'm in this relationship for the benefit of the other person. And we have that with God. We experience a love relationship with God to where we know He is committed to my best, my benefit. But am I committed to His? And when I'm in this and have accepted this definition of a Christian, then yeah, I'm on God's team. I know God's on my team, but am I on His team? It's a two-way street. I will experience joy, the joy of Christ from having this close relationship. That as He gives us His joy, our joy may be complete as we react with one another in this relationship. That this joy is this deep sense of contentment that we're doing the right thing with our lives. I believe that's what people need more than anything else, is to know that their life brings pride to God, and we experience that joy as a result. We will experience the fullness of love, and I don't know. I just had a moment when I was reading this passage recently, and that is, so verse 13 says, "No one has greater love than this, that someone would lay down his life for his friends." When I read that verse, you know what I always had in my mind? Jesus. And no doubt, but I think he's talking about us. So when I read this, Jesus was the epitome of this. But the fullness of love is willing to be sacrificial toward others. willing to be sacrificial toward others. That's the fullness of love. That takes our faith to a whole different level. And this final point here that he makes at the end of the passage, to be known as a friend of God. And he makes the point that he says, I no longer call you my servants, my slaves. That relationship doesn't exist anymore. Because you know my business and you carry that out. That makes us friends. So that's what I think Jesus wants us to grasp. I think that's where the confidence that we see as Jesus embattled so many people in the struggle of just being faithful and living out his call, living out his purpose. He's talked about this special relationship with God. And I think that's part of it. Being known as a friend of God. Fruit comes in INN, in many forms. It certainly has to do with our lifestyle habits, and that's what Jesus is trying to get across to us here. Living lives of obedience, allowing the Spirit to have His way in our life so that there's the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. It is really, the goal is disciples making disciples and investing ourselves into others who will be able to do the same things and pass on this ethic. So the lifestyle habits are really kind of what we're talking about as far as fruit. And the result being the positive influence on another person. But it's not always easy to get there. And so I wanted to close out our time looking at a couple of steps to building fruitful habits. So I want you to turn to Ephesians 4 as we wrap up our time this evening. Ephesians 4. When we begin to look at Scripture as our instructions on how to live the life that God expects us to live, we begin to see things and patterns and this four-chair metaphor that helps me to see where I am in my faith walk, in my journey as a disciple. Dealing with habits and building new habits is definitely a part of becoming one who glorifies God. And so, let's see. Beginning in verse 17. It says, "Therefore I say this and testify in the Lord, you should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their thoughts." So that's the transformation. We're changing our thinking about this stuff. If I don't think it's important that I bear fruit, I may have to consider what my thought process is. Whether I'm still stuck in the futility of my thoughts. He says they are darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them and because of the hardness of their hearts. They became callous and gave themselves over to promiscuity for the practice of every kind of impurity with the desire for more and more. great commentary on our society today. But this is not how you learned about the Messiah, assuming you heard about him and were taught by him, because the truth is in Jesus. You took off your former way of life, the old self that is corrupted by deceitful desires. You are being renewed in the spirit of your minds, and you put on the new self, the new one created according to God's likeness in righteousness and purity of truth. Now, I'm going to give you the first one. So, and then we're going to have like a time of maybe silence. So everyone should have your Bible open to this passage if you don't already. It's going to be a little on-the-spot homework right here. Since, so verse 25 says, since you put away lying, speak the truth to one another, because we are members of one another. So there are 3 steps here. I'll actually do the second one too for you. So, but see if you see this pattern. Step 1, stop. Stop doing what you're doing. Just stop it. And then replace it with something else. And there's going to be a result of bearing fruit. Now in this one he says, put away lying, speak the truth, each one to his neighbor. And the goal is unity. The fruit is unity. Do you see that? Next one, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. The thief must no longer steal. Instead, he must do honest work with his own hands, so that he has something to share with anyone in need. Verse 28 is the it's the key verse to seeing this pattern. The thief must no longer steal. Stop stealing. If you're stealing, stop it. Replace it. How do we replace it? By working with your hands. Why? So that you can give something to someone else. See, there's fruit. I stop doing the habit. I replace it with something else. But in the Christian faith, we go a little bit further than that. We put ourselves in a position to bless someone else's life, to do good works, as Jack said already. That's how we begin to change the habits of our lifestyle. It's and a lot of people stop, but then they start again because they're not replacing it. Or maybe they're replacing it, but they're still just living for themselves. If we are doing something that demonstrates this bearing of fruit, that's when the habit changes. That's when a new lifestyle habit emerges. And we begin to look like Jesus in our interactions with people. So when you read the rest of that, we won't have this period of quiet, but when you read the rest of that, you see the same pattern. And that's Paul's intent. Paul's working with individuals who are new to the faith. And, it doesn't matter where we're from. We live in a culture that is so steeped in selfishness that it's easy for that to kind of bleed over on us. And to be able to see the pattern and the difference between what it means to be a Christian and what it means to not be a Christian. It's significant for us to see this pattern and to realize that in order for me to become what Jesus wants me to be, I have to be intentionally about cultivating this space. And in my garden, I did all the right things, but I did nothing well. And I kind of did it just to go through the motions, hoping that something would result. And something did result, but it wasn't anything. I wasted time, money, effort, resources. And I probably could have bought a lot of corn with that. All the effort I put into that. Jesus loved the world. and he loves the world. But his mission was not to reach the world. His mission was to reach 12 who would go on and reach the world.